I have no aspiration for that whatsoever.
Okay, guys, let's dig into it. For the second year in a row, we've had record flood levels in New Brunswick. When a once-in-a-lifetime event happens once, it's an anomaly. When it happens twice, it's a pattern, right? So, Graeme, maybe we can get you to speak about where we are right now in terms of how high the floodwaters are, and then Don, maybe we'll move into you talking about what's being done about it, the community rally, the municipal response.
Sure.
And we'll go from there.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. This is the second time in actually 12 months, because we're a few weeks ahead of last year, that we've seen flood levels rise within the St. John River, Woolastook, to what are considered historic highs. And, whether it's a few centimeters above and below at the end of today or tomorrow when we find out, and the waters rise again over the weekend according to the provincial forecast in Fredericton, we're seeing a severe and, I think, unsurprising for many of us who work within watershed and watershed management, but surprising a little bit in that it came so soon again. I think we thought in many ways this was not a matter of if, but when, but that we might have more time to learn our lessons and to implement changes from last year. And here we are again.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so, Graeme. There's a couple of components to this. Historic 1973, and then to 2008, and 2008 we thought was bad, and then 2018, and 2018. I think really caught everybody. We thankfully here in the city of St. John, we have highly skilled and highly trained professionals to move into our emergency response teams, to our command center. It's like you see in the movies as we speak. There's a bunch of folks who haven't had the number of showers they normally have, and they've been in a room 24/7 with shifts, and they have day jobs, but then they don their vests and their operations, communications, all of the various roles. So first of all, I want to shout out to them and say thank you for the role that they play in public safety. That is the number one role.
Incredible work.
Absolutely, and really understated, because there's they have to plan for 50 things that may happen, and only one might happen, but they plan for all 50. But I think back, I just want to pick up on it's just where we are really quickly. It's Friday morning. It looks like we're going to peak out today, but as Graeme has said, look, we speaking to the mayor of Fredericton a day or two ago, they thought they peaked and the water went up 2 feet overnight. So I think we've got
2 feet.
Yeah, we've got more work ahead of us here, and just even saying to folks, like, even once we've peaked, wherever peak is, whether it's today or tomorrow or the next day, for that water to recede again is another week plus, and then there's cleanup, and then
some of your greatest risks really coming after that.
Yeah, well, and contaminants in the water and all kinds of things. But I just want to go back for a second. I think we did. We learned from the plan last year. We met. We talked about it. We talked about how we were going to adjust. We communicated. We did open houses. We tried to do a number of preemptive moves. And I started driving around the community all around the community, the greater community, on Friday, and I did it again on Saturday, and I did it again on Sunday, and I called city officials on Sunday and I said, no one's moving, nothing's happening, and then wasn't really until Monday, and I said, folks, there's going to be panic, and there's going to be a lot of panic. And so there's a human psychology, there's something here that, again, remember 1973, 2008, 2018. So, we must have until 2023, right?
Yeah.
And here we go again. So, look, I think the response has been good, but I think there's a lot of lessons, and there are always, and there isn't anyone in our organization that would disagree with I hope with what I'm about to say, and that is that we can always do better.
Yeah.
And now this conversation that we've been having, it can't be ignored. A conversation about climate change, about the change in our community, and what the impacts of that change are going to be. And then just one more, and then I'll give the mic back. I just want to also say, to the citizens that I've visited with, to you, the heartache that I see in your face and hear in your words, and I see in your body, and I know for the little bit of sandbagging that I did yesterday, my back is really sore, and so this is really tough on a community, and it's heart-wrenching to see people, and probably the most moving emotional piece for me is actually saw a number of people just gave up, didn't put a think about what a home represents for us, who just gave up and didn't even attempt to fight back the mighty river.
I want to, just for a second, speaking to the human side of this thing, because one of the things that I've always loved about the Maritimes, and one of the things that gets me to stay actually and want to be a professional and have my career here, is the community response when things like this happen is actually pretty surreal. In 2018, I work pretty closely with the newcomer community, and when we were out sandbagging, the amount of newcomers who were there actively engaging with their community and understanding that this was a community-wide effort. Yeah. I wrote a feature in James Mollinger's magazine, The Maritime Edit, called Waters Rising, about this analogy that how divided, or not necessarily divided, but how disconnected we are day to day. When something like this happens, you really understand that it really takes everybody.
Yeah. And that's the benefit, I think, of our very manageable sized communities, where we had somebody come by our office from somewhere else, visiting from Ontario, and you walk outside, and of course you see the first person and it's that wave, and they said, this is like the Truman Show or something. I didn't know this place still existed. Right. Yeah. And that face on the individuals is what makes it so compelling to help them, to help anyone when something like this catastrophic happens, whether it's the first time in 30 years or, again, for the second time in 12 months, you put a face to it, and you can relate to, this is a shared struggle that we all have.
I think it's what we love so much, whether we can articulate it in words. It's what we love so much about this community. It's that I often say, the comfort I have in my coffee being prepared as I just walk in the door, that I know the story behind so many people, that people care about each other in this community. It's so wonderful. You speak to newcomers. Man, last year, one of my most memorable moments was going to a sandbagging station, and I was sort of on tour and saying thank you to volunteers, and a newcomer group was there, and in a bit of broken English, new language, right? The newcomer said, Canada helped me, I help Canada. I was like, oh my gosh, like what a strong sort of lesson. And in the same breath, I would just throw out a bit of a warning that if we're completely reliant on volunteers all the time, what I've seen this year is number one, it's very dangerous work. We chose to go in another direction in terms of some of that operational type of work, but some of the homeowners have said to me, Don, I couldn't get anybody. Folks came out last year. It was a bit novel, and it was very urgent. But it was backbreaking.
There's already a fatigue from last year still.
So if your plan is we're just going to put an email out and everyone's going to come in droves, well, that's great if it's once every 10 or 12. I personally would think that'd be a very risky plan if it's every 12 months.
So I want to talk a little bit about where you see, and we're fortunate to have the mayor of St. John here, the idea that we as a community, as Greater St. John even, are obviously empowered in a lot of great ways around emergency measures, being supported by the province and all these other entities. But the idea that this watershed, which is affecting us right now, is very much outside of our boundaries, well away. People don't really even know where this water is coming from. If you asked someone, they just say downriver or from the north. And there's not this clear understanding of just how complex the second largest watershed on the eastern seaboard of North America is when it meets the highest tides in the world.
So,
And
Graeme, maybe
this
break that
challenge
down
there.
for a minute. Maybe break that down. Where is the water coming from? What's the...
Well, that's a great question. What's really interesting about the St. John River Woollistic watershed is that it is transboundary. And in many ways, it's four nations. If you count Maine, the province of Quebec, which considers itself a nation in many regards, and is in many regards, New Brunswick, and of course our First Nations as well. And that means that there are a great many jurisdictions, a great many, not just landowners, but institutions which are charged with the care of this watershed. And so when we get these snows up north, and as our climate change models, at least in New Brunswick, show, there'll be increased precipitation in coming years on to 2050 and onward. And as that meltwater comes with an earlier spring in some cases, we're getting this increased freshet. I mean, yes, a freshet is a natural spring event. We even have whole streams which only exist during a freshet event.
Right.
And that's a normal part of our geography. But when it's coming at this rate and at this volume, we built in areas which we weren't prepared to see this happen in. And that's something that comes along with, we're all attracted to water as humans. All of our greatest cities for a great many years were all located where there was food or water and a source. And here we are in St. John, a wonderful example with so many beautiful waterfronts and lakes and the Bay of Fundy. And that attraction to water has put a lot of people in precarious positions. So I want to ask Don a little bit about what he sees as a municipal role for this. Because again, people have a difficulty parsing, I think, sometimes those differences, where we as citizens of St. John and where the office of the mayor and the council and the staff of St. John can help those same people we're talking about, the heartbreak that they're experiencing, to find resiliency, to find a life that doesn't involve sandbagging and calling you to see about volunteers every spring.
Yeah, so a couple of things. I for me, it starts with, not dismissing it as a spring flood, and that probably next year it'll be great. Everything will be wonderful. I think, we have to recognize that, there's enough indicators, across the, the globe and in Canada and right here in New Brunswick, and then bring it right home to our beautiful city. There's lots of indicators that we're in changing times. The city is, as you know, we're working with you, Graeme. I'm proud. I'm not an expert, but I believe we don't have our heads in the sand. I mean, we're going to have to adapt and we're going to have to change. So our climate adaptation plan, the greenhouse gas emissions and energy use reduction plans. So you have to have the plans. It can't just be words. I've been approached many times about. I know it's a symbolic gesture, the climate emergency motions that some councils, and I just want to understand it. I'm saying to Linnea and others, look, we are taking action. I use the word in my media interviews yesterday, climate emergency. I believe we're in an emergency situation. But I also can tell you that if I were to take a stab at it, probably 85% of motions that came before the council over the last 15 years never went anywhere because they were, great to get your name in the newspaper. I don't want that. I want meaningful dialogue and meaningful action. So back to your question, Graeme, I for sure we're going to have to adapt here in St. John. We're going to have to adapt, how we build, where we build, those standards, our infrastructure. We've already had that conversation. Where we've estimated, round one, 20 million, round two, probably 75 to $100 million worth of infrastructure that's being climate impacted now. But it can't just be us. Has to be our neighbors, has to be the province of New Brunswick, has to be interprovincial. And we don't do that well, right? We don't do that, whether it's an energy project or anything else. We don't do the interprovincial thing very well. And and I'm going to get myself probably in a bit of trouble. I'd say, let's sprinkle in a little bit of politics over all this too, right? And we still have politicians that are taking the climate change doesn't exist positions, and so I think we also have to navigate through the politics of this. It's hard to say, you know what, folks, we're not building any more X, Y, or Z's because we have to put money into renewing our core infrastructure. But that's the prudent and the right thing to do. So I think it's a conversation that cities and provinces need to have together. And I thank you for the education, Graeme, on where does all this water come from? Thank you for that. And it just shows that we have to pull the onion back and understand at the root cause what is going on and what are we going to do about it, and for not only present generations but future generations be leaders. And for me, I don't understand all the implications or the ripples or what I call the knock-on impacts yet. But I certainly know that what we're facing is not just a one-off, and that we have a responsibility and an obligation to work through this and let data and make good decisions and put plans in place.
Sorry, go ahead.
And like you said, Don, this is municipal, provincial. It's statewide, and then it's national, and then it's international. When you're looking at climate as a whole, when you're seeing hockey stick graph after hockey stick graph, and then can look a community in the face and say, this is a spring flood, it's very clearly not a spring flood. I was listening to Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is a science communicator we all know and love, and the interviewer asked him, is the answer more STEM and STEAM training in schools? And he said, well, no, it's actually starts with getting our elected officials and our middle-aged folks scientifically literate. What are we going to do? Are we going to teach STEAM in elementary schools, wait 40 years for these people to run for parliament and then make decisions on these changes? We can't. And the reason why we can't is it will be too late. So the fact that our elected officials want to step up and be a part of the solution and say, look, this is happening. How do we adapt? And we'll go back to Graeme on this point, because there's two parts of this. There's response when an event happens, and then there's management prior to events happening. Yeah. It's like Randy Hatfield, the executive director of the Human Development Council, who we all know and love, is saying the solution to homelessness is not to build more homeless shelters. That's a response to the event, but it's not management prior to the event unfolding.
Yeah. And that's an excellent point. When it comes to watersheds or habitats or environments in general, is that we, for a very long time, have looked at it as a response. The decline in bald eagle populations. Well, we have to do breeding programs and we have to do this and this instead of addressing the habitat they live in, because there are other species instead of just the famous iconic one that's on a flag or a seal. And we're in the similar position when it comes to some of these climate change issues, where the flooding is what we're feeling right now, and we're doing an excellent job, as Don described, responding to. But it's not the only impact of changing temperatures and precipitation patterns, and we're just not necessarily seeing or feeling those yet. But they will be and are a reality. And the idea that we have to plan for these things, but also use these responses as a rallying point. And I talked about this a number of times this week with a number of media outlets. We have more knowledge, you could argue, about the St. John River or Willistic watershed than any freshwater system in Canada now, thanks to the Canadian Rivers Institute, thanks to the 20-odd watershed groups that work along it, thanks to the work of the municipalities, the province's LIDAR investments in recent years, which have really highlighted an incredible amount of detail and an incredible amount of science and study, and hopefully more and more integration of traditional knowledge as well. And we're at that point where we're now creating libraries of information, or virtual digital libraries, I should say, since it's mostly in hard drive form. But what are we going to do with it? What's the next management step? We're the only transboundary watershed in the country without an international joint commission. We don't have that central body that can force, a governor and a premier together to manage this system. So we need to do what Maritimers in New Brunswick do best and find rallying points in our community to make that the case. We have the expertise and the know-how to create the planning, as we're working on in the city of St. John. But many of our impacts lie beyond that. I described the river coming down is a great example of that. And the work that we can do around working to shape provincial policy around not just wetlands, all the way through to the way the river itself is managed. We're starting to see the cyanotoxins, which killed luckily just dogs last year and spared human life. But the risks associated with that, again, impacts changes to our river, which many people wrote and foresaw in science years prior. And we didn't have the response, so to speak, to that. And I think it really behooves us all to have these discussions now while this topic is hot. And to not let it be a matter of fatigue, as we talked about with sandbags, let it not falter because we survived the flood. Our response was amazing. Speaking about it past tense, as if it won't come again.
Right.
It's a matter of being, as our emergency measures officials have done, learning those lessons from what happened and bringing those lessons to implement changes in policy and bringing about real actions which bring resiliency to our community so that they're not feeling that fear, so that they can enjoy the blooms of spring, not the floods of spring.
I think we touched on it. I think we're having a conversation here. Thanks for the opportunity to have a conversation this morning about this. This is incredibly important. I think there's a whole litany of reasons why maybe we're not as far along in the journey as we could be or should be, Graeme. But fear and there's many. I'm not sure. Frankly, I agree that we have the political will today. I think some politicians have the political will. I don't believe all politicians do. And again, I mean, it's part of the toughest thing about my job, and the part I dislike the most is politics. And what do I mean by that? I mean, we're having data-driven, meaningful conversations about what we should do and how that's going to improve quality of life for the community. But because people resist that, sometimes special interest, because somebody won't get what they want out of that, the idea dies on the table. But this topic we're talking about here, I'm not for a moment. I mean, so we need to educate people. We need to have folks understand, but we also need to figure out how we can move a core group of folks. We need to build an army, a climate change army, an adaptation army, and champions who are prepared to stand up. And I know that exists, but I just think for a lot of people, they're going to get through this horrific event and they're going to settle right back into, well, I bet you it won't won't happen again for 20 years. And so I think that piece of this is an incredibly important part of what success looks like. It's getting people engaged, and there's so many other topics. We need to attract 120,000 new people to our province over the next 20 years, and 67% of New Brunswickers feel like we've got just enough immigrants. We don't need any more. Right. So there's this huge disconnect. Sure. So somehow we have to connect that back to people in a way that resonates for them.
Yeah, and this disconnect, like you said, Don, and 67% thinking we're at the levels of immigration we need to be at, and a similar number thinking we're as diverse or more as the rest of the country.
Right.
And so clearly we haven't used our passports enough, and we haven't seen what's out there because our communities are changing. One of the things that you hit on, and Graeme is very good at hitting on, is we need to tell the story of these changes really well. Unfortunately, it is the political realm that often falls victim to not being well understood. You must be pulling your hair out when you're making a change that you truly believe in, and you're hearing that people just aren't getting why the change is being made. And that's on us. It's also on them. We can't take personal responsibility off the table, but it's also on us to explain this well. The whole point of doing Matt George Unsettled and navigating changes that are coming for us quickly is that when you look at something like climate science, it's not tangible. People don't understand where they fit until a flood comes knocking at the door, and all of a sudden we have 75 to 100 million in infrastructure affected. They don't know where they fit. And so now we're seeing that, wow, climate change is coming, and here I am with 3 feet of water in the kitchen, and now I know where I fit. But we can't wait for crises to understand where we fit in this thing.
Yeah. And it's difficult, and I deal with this all the time, working in all environmental science, but climate change is the one where this is the most challenging because it's always talked about in the news as a global challenge. We have so much to do and it's overwhelming to people. And I don't know how many times I've heard that over the years that, what's my role? I'm one person. We're just New Brunswick. What we do isn't going to make a difference of that within that. And that communication gap has really made our challenge even greater because we don't have, as Matt's alluding to, a way to humanize the problem. It's not down to what's going to happen to them until it does. And we see climate migration already taking place in some areas, and those people would definitely understand. We see loss of water sources in the north of Canada where temperatures are rising faster than almost anywhere else, certainly within our country or within our continent. So the idea that it's elsewhere is part of the issue. And I can not describe to you how big a sea change there was in New Brunswick and in St. John after the flood of 2018 with the response from the community, from policymakers, from politicians, because there was something tangible to speak to. It went from being this, well, we can plan for that eventually, and you're right, by 2050 we'll have something sorted out, to we saw what's taking place. You're getting calls from the Toronto Star, 3, 4, 5 national insurance companies calling my organization, ACAP St. John, and saying, how can we invest in planning and mapping in your community? Because they see and witnessed the impact it had on. I was going at the map that we have for our adaptation plan yesterday in the office, and we calculated how many residential properties somewhere on the property have floodwater at the current levels on them. And it was, based on the current assessment, $220+ million of private property, not including this, the public infrastructure Don was speaking to. And of those building footprints directly affected, it was nearly 70 million. And that's just in a community of 68,000 people. And that's a direct, significant impact on
So
people.
think of the scale of what we're talking about here. Think of the scale just in our nation, right? But two comments I want to make. One is, my view is never waste a good crisis, and I don't mean that in a. But look, if what it takes to get people engaged in a conversation is to them, them having a sore back from all the sandbags they put out. I think again it comes, one of the challenges so that's one point. The second point is one of the challenges we have is that, we're gonna continue to struggle when there's folks of what I'd call opposing forces that they can be local, they can be provincial, they can be national, that have millions of dollars to spend against the change.
Sure.
I see that in whether it's this conversation today or, why not? Why haven't we done this? Why hasn't the city done this? Why, even some of the debate last night at the debate, it's like, oh my gosh, come on, folks. Like it's, it isn't simple because there's always another side. And sometimes that other side has a lot of resources and it has the hot buttons. So, I think again, this conversation that we have and we continue to have at all levels, and then it's going to come down to leadership. It's we have to have champions, and we've got them. We are a city full of champions, and we have to support the champions, and we have to navigate, and we have to recognize that people are afraid. It's money. It's for individuals, it's their home. I mean, it represents their, in most cases, sole source of what they believed was a bit of equity, policy and decision makers. They need to be educated. They need to understand. There's always trade-offs. If we get really good about climate change, we're going to kill the economy. That's. I'm not saying that's what I believe. But that's
an argument.
Yeah. Look at again, if we hold AIM accountable to not polluting the environment, not doing noise pollution, and ensuring that we can move forward in a balanced way. Everyone's going to lose their job. I mean, here's a live example. We're trying to get Market Slip dredged again so that we can get the docks back in so we can enjoy this beautiful river and ocean that we have. And it's been silted in. And there's environmental contaminants in that silt. So, where did that come from? And so I guess a couple things. Those are the things. We have to figure out change is incredibly difficult for people, and if it's difficult for people, then often what I've seen in 3 short years as a political elected figure is it is hard to get political leaders to make those decisions if the masses believe X.
Yeah.
It's hard to get folks to stand up, and we see that being demonstrated across the country and across the nation, whether it's a carbon tax debate or whatever. I'm a big believer that if you don't like Plan A, I like to hear what your plan is, because rhetoric and criticizing and that's not a plan.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think
ahead, Graeme.
it's really. I love your line about not wasting a good crisis, in the sense that historically, a lot of jurisdictions, and I think ourselves included, responded well to reinventing themselves. Look at the architecture of the neighborhood we are around, which was built in response to a great fire in the 19th century, and we rebuilt in a more resilient, more fireproof way, using brick and other materials. And that's learning from a past event and responding as a community and rebuilding. And I think that's a message that I always try to bring to New Brunswick, is we live in a very unique corner of Canada or North America where growth rates are a little slower, where we have a higher rural proportion of population, where there's a lot of differences. And those can be strengths, and we can address some of the issues, whether it's generational poverty in St. John or infrastructure deficits, through the lens of creating resiliency to climate change. That these are not one-offs where we've lost 80% of the wildlife in our jurisdiction by species diversity. We've had these homes inundated 2 years in a row by a flood event. There are rallying points from a lot of different sectors that can come together. So it's about creating a resilient community. I use the example a lot in St. John around creating an environment that's healthy for people creates more opportunities for success. And that's something that we've learned scientifically a great deal lately. I had the good fortune of spending some time with a man who was the former head of housing and urban development in the first Obama administration a few years ago. He was describing that one day the Department of Justice came knocking on his door, and he said, oh no, what's going on? What are they doing? And they came to him and said, we heard what you'd been saying about these housing projects, these low-income, low-test score, high-crime neighborhoods for a long time, and about building sustainable communities. So we decided to do our own study about it. And they looked at crime, because it was the Department of Justice, in neighborhoods with a lot of green space or trees on the streets or access to the natural environment. And all things being equal, the same ethnic background, the same religious background, the same demographics according to census data, or same income level, the crime rates were 30 to 40% lower simply because that access to green space changed the brain chemistry of the people living within it. And those are the kind of adaptations that, if we look at options around resilient natural systems, and that's not the only change to adapt to climate change, but there are ways we could check off a few of these boxes and work with and across sectors and across jurisdictions, perhaps to create a new model for success here in New Brunswick. And that's the kind of thing that we can export, that we can be proud of. And it's about creating opportunities out of these crises, to go back to
I keep coming back to how we can really do a lot of good in communicating these big changes by telling local stories. Again, people don't understand climate change, but they do understand if their neighbor in Rossay, who's banking on selling their home as part of their retirement, suddenly has 3 feet of water in the kitchen, and it's just not going to be possible anymore. The European Union started talking about these changes in 2006. The chair of the European Union in 2007, in a speech, said, "We can't imagine the future as something that comes without us." In the Maritimes, I think we have, for all of the great things we do have, I think we have a problem with thinking that the future comes with or without us. That we're over here, we're not economically important, we're watching what the rest of the world is doing in New York and London, but we're not participating. So like you say, Graeme, we're not participating in climate change globally, but all of a sudden there's 75 to 100 million in new infrastructure developments. Yes, we definitely are. So we need to get a grip on, we need to understand that we have a place in this dialogue, right? We have a place in this change.
I think again, there's a number of factors. Regardless of the topic, we could do 5 more podcasts today, and they're each of the topics, the major topics for the city, region, province they're complex. And I think we have to break down very complex topics and into bite-sized pieces.
Absolutely.
But the fundamental that I want to get on the table here is, and we've not been great at it, frankly. We do a lot of things well. We're an amazing community of generous, kind people. But whether it be our financial future, we've not managed it well with a long-term plan. Our growth future, we've not managed it well with a long-term plan. Poverty, which we spoke a lot about last night. My personal view is, in some cases, it's turned into a business for people, and we need to have long-term plans and outcomes, and work that plan, and then it takes discipline. Because I think that most sane people would agree that we have a climate change is upon us, and we have an obligation to be stewards and to but it is going to be hard. Like, that's my view today. I think it's going to be hard. Doesn't mean we don't have it. Like everything, when I decided to run and I was asking my family if they would be okay. Yeah. Probably the most wise advice I got was from my daughter Megan. And she said, "Dad, what are you worried about?" And I said, "I think it's going to be really hard." And she paused for a minute and she said, "Dad, but isn't anything that's worthwhile to do really hard?" And it's like, holy boy, it was a real moment, for me. And when you're 21
Must
or
have
20,
done some good parenting to get.
Yeah, well, look, I'd like to claim that, but probably it was my wife, But when your 22-year-old says, "Man, like good stuff is hard, right?" So this, I think, it's going to be really hard. It's going to be hard to a year from now make that disciplined decision. We're not building the rank. We're going to go over here instead. We're not doing this. We're not going to just say, "No, homeowner, you're on your own." We're not going to give a corporation another $20 million to do X. We're going to invest $20 million in climate change. We're going to ask people to pay, or to do things differently. So we need reform for the city on, taxes, arbitration, revenue generation, regionalization. Well, we need reform on climate change too. And how are we going to figure out? So the leadership component of this is something, frankly, I'm really worried about, because it is really hard. And change is, if I had a buck for every sleepless night, it's change is difficult. Yeah. So I don't have the answer today, but as a community, we have to figure out how we're going to educate and motivate the stakeholders to make the change. And in some cases, perhaps we may not see all of the benefit for decades. In fact, we may never see it. But we go to, we know that our grandchildren will see it, and so on and so forth.
Graeme, maybe you can take us home here. You wrote a piece yesterday called "Rising to the Occasion," and it's approaching 1,000 reads. And it's the perfect title, and I'm looking at it right now. And for listeners, it's a white title set on a backdrop of a photo of significant flooding, and it really is the perfect title with the perfect photo. Why don't you take us home here? What does rising to the occasion on this thing mean?
Well, just as Don was saying, rising to the occasion is really all about learning the lessons that are right in front of us, and bringing those home and making it a community and a provincial and an international response to challenges affecting real people. And that's really what it's about. The idea that, as I described, we know so much about these watersheds now, and we're learning more every day. After I finish up here, I'm going to Fredericton for a meeting quite literally about watershed management and about a model with Canadian Rivers Institute and WWF Canada and UNB and the federal government on this topic that we started 2 years ago. And the idea that we're building information, we're creating potential solutions and removals of barriers. Because change is all about barriers. If you, for example, somebody asks you to bike to work, you're going to think about all the things that means. Where am I going to park it when I get there? Am I going to be sweaty? Do I have a place to share? You think about, as soon as there's a, but if I do this, then you might not do it. And we need to create pathways for change to allow people to rise to the occasion and to support these people. This isn't about telling people that they've been wrong about where they've been living or that they're desiring the wrong thing in life. It's that there are, in 2019, and there will be in 2020, real responses and solutions to these challenges. But perhaps our jurisdictions don't support them the right way, or we don't coalesce to respond together and listen to the brilliant minds who work at the City of St. John in engineering or emergency measures. We don't listen enough to and give voice to the watershed organizations that work from the Meduxnakeg to the Tobique to our First Nations throughout the watershed about what they see and about what they feel, and creating avenues where we work together and we're empowered and we have the support of, as we all know, the economic situations of our community, support from the rest of our country and province as well, to say that we're not going to leave people behind because of climate change. We're going to make sure that St. John adapts and has flood resiliency the same way that someday we're going to have clean drinking water in all of our First Nations in Canada. It's about bringing the strength of our fellow citizens together. And that's what Rise in the Occasion was, is that without getting too complex, is there are solutions, and the people who know these solutions live right here in our own backyards. I drive past or walk past some of their homes every day, and I know that they're there. And we need to give them the opportunity to not only make an impact, but to have that impact resonate across our community. And that's exciting to me. I hope that people listen to that message and not only get excited, but want to be a part of that change. And whether it's led by Don here, by you, Matt, by me, whoever, it's about a cooperative action that can mean that whether you live in Milford or whether you live in Rosse or anywhere in between, you feel like the spring flood or the freshet or the change in sea level is something to feel like you have a resilience to, and that your neighbors are going to be there, but that your government is going to be there to support you, and that there are organizations all around you that support that as well. And I think that's exciting, but we need to talk about this now, and I think we're doing a fantastic job of driving that narrative.
Yeah, and we want to leave the studio with some action. So let's hear from you, Don, too, about what actions our community can take and where we are right now and the support that we need.
Yeah, so obviously we're still in the, I would call it the middle of the event. I'll leave here and go up to our emergency center. Our folks are tired, so just we'll drop in for 5 minutes and just thank them for everything they're doing. I'll spend the rest of my day, out, frankly, quite operational. Just jeans on, golden retriever in the back, to do some puppy love out in the scene. I've got cooler of water, and just to try and mentally prop up folks. And there'll be cleanup. We'll need a lot of volunteers to help us clean up and help people. And then we have to, we have to have and continue this. The good news is there will be more people on the side of this conversation next week than there were last week. And, we need stewards. And I just want to, before I forget, I want to, say how grateful I am to have leaders in our community like you, Graeme, and you, Matt, to continue to do what you do, to do your day jobs, but also to just be caring and compassionate thought leaders and champions of change. And we need that. Somebody has to go first to help others find the courage to get and step into this conversation. So thank you for what you're doing. There will be conversation. There will be actions. We just need to make sure they're meaningful, and we need to make sure they're pointed in the right direction. That's going to be the challenge, because there'll be reaction. And sometimes those, let's do this are not always the best ideas. So, I like to say to folks, let's slow down to hurry up. Let's get the right plan in place. Let's make sure we've got the right data. Let's make sure we have a long term in mind, and let's bring all the stakeholders to the table and try to move this forward. So that's what I see in the, in the future here. What does near term mean? We're going to continue to do work through the next year. This will be a conversation that will be happening. But the flip side of it, guys, just to be straight up, 30 days from now, the majority of people will not be talking about this issue. Mm-hmm. It'll be a core group of folks. So it's up to those that care about it deeply, who care about their community deeply, that care about their province and their nation and the globe deeply, and to break that down into bite-sized pieces. Sometimes some of the champions who I love champions' passion, but they're so overwhelming in their ask. It's such a big bite, that you don't know where to start.
Yeah.
So I think it's incumbent on the thought leaders to break this down into people. What can we do? That next time we issue an infrastructure project, can we adapt it? Can we do this? Can we put it in a larger pipe? Can we I don't know those answers, but those are tangible steps that we we just issued $10 million in contracts in the last week. Was that, were those contracts adapted appropriately? I don't know the answer. But so let's break this down. It can't all be massive change. It has to be bite-sized pieces that lead to a long-term plan.
Yep.
So thanks for the opportunity today.
Gentlemen, you have an open invitation for a seat at the table anytime you want it. We're going to put this out as a Flood 2019 special. Hopefully we'll get this out on your platforms as well, Graeme, and
Great.
we'll get as many people as we can tuned into the conversation. And like Don said, we need to know where we fit. We need to know where we fit, and we need to know what action we take. So with that being said, let's wrap this thing up. Mayor Don Darling, Graeme Stewart-Robertson, thanks for coming in, guys.
Thank you so much.
We'll keep the conversation
Thank
going.
you.
Bye, everybody.